Well, Donna, thank you very much for joining me today. And one of the challenges that I had preparing for this interview was knowing where to start, because there are so many different topics that we could cover and so many things that you know so much about. So what I'd like to start, before we talk about your book, The Delinquent Teenager, which I'd love to get into in a minute, I want to know, why did you write a book? Why did you think it was necessary for yourself to get into this issue of climate change and to write about the subjects that you did?
Well, I left journalism after a number of years. I decided to do something else with my life, and I went off in a totally different direction. And then I started getting very annoyed and very alarmed, because every time I opened a newspaper or turned on the television, this was about 2009, it was climate change, climate change. The seas are going to overwhelm us, and the planet is going to turn into a fireball. And the coverage seemed very shallow to me. It seemed like the journalists were just repeating dogma, and they were repeating conventional wisdom, and that there was no scrutiny, and there was no there was no scrutiny at all. So I started doing a bit of my own research, just sort of out of curiosity. This doesn't sound right. This might.
So, if I can interrupt, at that point, did you have an overarching view on climate change?
Not at all. And I had not, as a journalist before, in my previous incarnation as a journalist, written about the environment at all. It just has not been an area of concern to me. You know, privately, I love to ride my bicycle and recycle and compost and garden, and I love nature and all those things, but the environment had never been something that I had paid any attention to. But it was the dogma and the rhetoric, and it sounded very exaggerated, and it sounded very ill-informed. So I started doing just a tiny bit of research on my own, and it didn't take me any time at all to find out that, in fact, there is a raging debate about climate in the science community, that there isn't just one point of view, that in fact there are many very credentialed, experienced, sincere scientists who have some very big doubts about the, we're all going to die, climate change is a catastrophe narrative. And I got very annoyed that I had not heard about those scientists, that I had only heard one side of the story. And so I had, one of the things I'd been dabbling in was some web design, and so I designed a website called noconsensus.org, and the purpose of that website was just to say to the public, there's another point of view out here, and if we're going to make informed decisions as a society, we should know what that other point of view is. And I don't know who's right, but there are scientists who disagree with the predominant view about climate change, and I think we should listen to them and take their views into account. So that's where it started.
Where it all started. Now that may come as something of a surprise for a lot of people, because we hear and we're reminded regularly that there is apparently a 97% consensus amongst the world's climate scientists. But you're saying that you found it very easy to find people who, in your view, are very well credentialed and had every right to speak on the subject. So why is there such a disparity between what you found and what we're being told in terms of the consensus? We're told that the science is settled, that there is a consensus. The only thing remaining left to do is to take action. There's no argument, there's no debate. So how come we're being told that if there is a debate?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One of them is that many journalists, unfortunately, are very sloppy. Some of them are rushed. You know, they have to produce more with less time, and climate science, it took me about a year of reading a lot of books and doing a lot of research before I felt comfortable saying much at all about what was going on in climate science. So it's a pretty big learning curve. So if you are just an ordinary journalist, general assignment journalist, you've been given the job of going and covering this climate change event where some famous scientist is saying that the world is about to end if we don't do something drastic, you don't really know any better. You really can't be expected to know any better. So between, inexperienced journalists, rushed journalists, and sloppy journalists, a lot of stuff is reported as fact, which is not fact. And then there's the other big problem, and that's that if you do a survey of journalists, any survey I've ever heard of in any country around the world, most journalists will self-identify as being left of center. And they are entitled to be left of center, but being left of center comes with some baggage. And one of the things that left of center people tend to be is very fervent environmentalists. And so rather than being a hard-nosed reporter who's skeptical of everything and is not going to take anyone's word for anything, the people on the environmental beat as journalists tend to go native. They tend to start seeing themselves as part of the cause, or helping the cause, helping get that message out. So they are, and I think shamefully, totally abandoning their duty to the public. It is not your role as a journalist to tell the public what the truth is. Your role is to tell them what's going on so that they can make their own informed decision.
Where does this 97% figure come from, this idea that there is a 97% consensus?
Well, the 97% has come up on a few occasions, and my understanding is that it is the result of some very flawed surveys of the scientific literature, not of scientists, because to my knowledge, no one has ever polled scientists and asked them some very, very specific but also very intelligent questions. For example, everyone is going to tell you, whether they are a skeptic or an alarmist with respect to climate change, that climate change happens. Of course climate change happens. Here in Canada, 20,000 years ago, we were buried under a couple miles of ice. That ice has been receding for 20,000 years. And back then, there were no SUVs and there was no heavy industry. The ice has been receding all on its own. It's part of natural climate change. Nothing ever stays static in nature. Things are always changing. So if you say, do you believe in climate change? Everyone is going to say yes. Every scientist is going to say yes. So that is not a useful question.
Right.
A useful question would be, do you think that human-generated CO2 emissions or human-generated greenhouse gases is a significant contributor to what we are seeing now? That would be a more intelligent question.
Right.
But that's not the kinds of survey questions that are being asked. So anyway, long story short, some very, very flawed surveys of literature in the scientific literature have been used to come up with this 97%. But, when you look at the methodology of those surveys, there's tons of problems. They're not reputable. But the side of the debate that is very concerned about climate change will seize on that 97% headline, and they're actually not very rigorous about looking underneath to see whether, is this reputable research or not. And so, for example, we're told that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is supposed to be this body of the world's top scientists, and they all agree that climate change is a big problem and it's caused by humans and it's going to be catastrophic. Well, that's absolutely false, because those scientists who work on those reports are not polled. No one asks them. No one asks them on an individual basis, do you agree with that statement? In fact, only a few dozen people who work on one particular chapter, which is the attribution chapter of an IPCC report, get to make a decision and express a viewpoint about whether this is predominantly linked to human activity. A very small number. So, 97% of scientists have never been asked that question. So, the perception that that's the case is it's wrong, and it doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of effort to do some very rudimentary research online and find that out.
Now, you mentioned flawed research and flawed methodologies, and I think that's a theme that really comes out in the book that you released. Can you tell me a little bit, just remind me what the title of that book is, and perhaps just take us through a survey of some of the key findings that you came across that really compelled you to need to write a book and let people know what you found.
Well, I started off thinking I was writing a very different book. My original idea was 10 reasons to be calm, cool, and collected about global warming. And it was going to be a list of, well, this is a bit fishy, and this doesn't quite sound right, and this very, very prominent scientist has raised these issues, so it was going to be, that was going to be the book. And then it turned out that I ended up writing a book about a United Nations body no one has ever heard of before. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you tell people, they say, oh, what's your book about? I say, it's about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They say, oh, what's that? So it's very difficult to write an expose about an organization no one's heard about. You know, you have to sort of be in the climate space for a little while and, paying attention to the debate before you even hear about this body. And the short form is IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel. And that's the key. This is not a panel of scientists. This is a panel of governments. It's a UN organization. The membership of the IPCC is nations. Okay, so this panel writes this report, this massive report. Around every 6 or 7 years, it comes out with a new one. This fall, in late 2013, there's going to be assessment report number 5. And sometimes those reports are called the Climate Bible, because they are supposed to be the last best word on what's happening in climate research. This panel is supposed to survey all that research and write a report, and then governments of the world take a look at that report and say, well, we have to act on climate change because the IPCC, this UN body, says it's happening and it's serious and it's our fault. So this report, so I started hearing about this report and this organization. I'm doing my research, and I got this picture in my mind of this organization because the praise was consistent across the board. Journalists thought this organization was fabulous. Scientists thought it was fabulous. And so I formed this picture in my mind of what the IPCC was. And it was of this very upstanding, meticulous professional in business attire. And, people use words like preeminent and authoritative and gold standard. This is the IPCC. And then something strange happened, because the more I actually learned about the IPCC, and because my background was investigative journalism, when someone says we do X, I don't take their word for it. I actually go and check. Do they do X? So once I started, doing some very basic fact checking, my image of the upstanding professional in business attire vanished, and what took its place was actually kind of a delinquent teenager.
Which is the title of your book, isn't it?
The delinquent teenager who was mistaken for the world's top climate expert. Very long title, but it's difficult. What do you say in your title? Expose of the IPCC. What's the IPCC? Actually, in the UK, the IPCC is the Police Complaints Commission. So I got this image. The image that was replaced and that I have been left with is of a very lazy, very slapdash, very spoiled child who has been praised and flattered its entire existence. The IPCC is now 25 years old and has never been subjected to any media scrutiny. All the journalists have given this organization a pass. Oh, it's helping, save the world. It's concerned about climate change. It must be, just a paragon of virtue. Well, actually, it's not. Actually, there are a great many serious problems with this organization. The big one being almost nothing it says about itself is actually true. So, yes, do some very basic fact checking, and you find out that the mythology that we have been been given about the IPCC that journalists have been repeating for decades turns out to be pretty much nonsense.
Well, you're going to have to come up with some pretty good specifics to back that up. Because as you say, they are the preeminent body, they are the number one. In a case of the IPCC's word against anyone else's word, the IPCC wins every single time.
That's right.
So for you to come out, I mean, people would be very quick to point out, A, you're not a climatologist.
That's right.
So who are you to criticise climatologists on issues of climate science? People will be very quick to point out that you're essentially a lone ranger, as it were, coming out and throwing rocks at a hornet's nest. Like, what's the game here? So specifics, please. What have you found specifically that might be able to convince me that the IPCC are not who I, like everyone else, have always been told they are?
One of the things, I'm going to give you specifics in just a second, but I'm just going to preface it by saying that I am not a scientist. Mm-hmm. I have no scientific training whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So I have not equipped to decide which scientist is right. Mm-hmm. So my criticism of the IPCC does not touch their science. Okay? What I am is a journalist, and I am perfectly capable of asking some very basic questions about an organization and whether the organization lives up to its billing, whether the things we have been told about the organization and how it behaves are actually true. You don't need to be a scientist to ask those questions, and every member of the public can understand those questions. So that is, I'm not a person to talk about which scientist or which scientific theory is right or wrong. I totally admit I have no idea. I'm not equipped to make that decision. So when we're talking about shortcomings, well, we have been told repeatedly that these are the world's top scientists, the best and the brightest, have been selected to write this report. No. Now, we must understand that because the IPCC is 25 years old and it is now completing its 5th major report, and there have been numerous smaller, shorter reports, there have probably been about 9,000 scientists over the years that have been involved as authors to some degree with the IPCC. Now, some of those scientists have in fact been brilliant, and they have been world-class experts at the top of their field. Okay, so I'm not going to say that every scientist has been a disappointment. But the problem is that there are lots of people who are helping to write the IPCC reports who are not world-class scientists. So one category is graduate students. Now, there's nothing wrong with graduate students helping a world-renowned authority do their research and helping them write up that research. That's not a problem. The problem is that the IPCC is making graduate students lead authors. Or even worse, coordinating lead authors, which means they're ahead in charge of a chapter. Okay, so we have a number of cases of this. We have a gentleman named Richard Klein who became a lead author for the IPCC at the tender age of 25. He was years and years and years from finishing his doctorate, but he was a lead author already. We have another gentleman who became a lead author for the IPCC. They're relying on his expertise, his expert judgment, before he'd even finished his master's degree. Yes, so, we're told that these are the best and brightest the world has to offer. No, I'm sorry. I found, and this was very unsystematic, this was just me, checking things out and stumbling across, a few cases which then ended up being, a number of cases, and I've written a chapter about this in my book, where, one of the women who was selected back in 1994, I think, to write the very first health chapter for the IPCC, in which they talked about malaria as being an issue with climate change, and they talked about it in a very amateurish, inaccurate way. Right. But people still, many years later, are still pointing to that and saying, the IPCC says malaria is going to get worse because of climate change. Well, this woman had not even she was, first of all, she was years from getting her PhD. It would be 16 years later before she completed her PhD. It would be 3 years before she published her first academic paper. She was not an expert in anything.
I'm sorry, she was a lead author?
I think at that point she was a contributing author.
But having not actually written a single piece of academic literature up until that point in time.
It would be 3 years before her first academic paper was published, and yet she was on the team. Her name is on that part of the IPCC report. So we have very young and inexperienced people. And again, I'm sure there are some very brilliant young people, but they're surely a rare occurrence in science for someone who has not even completed their doctorate to be, considered a world-class expert. And if those people are those exceptions, the IPCC really has to make the case. But it hasn't. It has a history since at least the mid-1990s of appointing very young, inexperienced people to be authors of its reports.
So unqualified scientists, obviously that's a fairly serious issue, particularly when you're dealing with a peak body such as the IPCC. But even if they're not qualified yet, if their methods are okay, then their work is probably going to be okay. So are you nitpicking at this point? Are you simply just trying to pick the eyes out of what they've done when the actual results stack up?
Well, it's not nitpicking. If an organization goes around telling you again and again and again, we are the world's top scientists, we are the creme de la creme, we are the best, and then you find out that you have these 20-something graduate students, you have been misled. And it's not just the graduate students. Another whole category of very questionable authors are people who have links to activist organizations, green organizations. Now, the IPCC is sort of like a trial, right? The people who work for the IPCC are holding a trial, and CO2 is the accused. And at the end of the day, they have to decide whether human-generated CO2 is guilty of causing possible climate catastrophe. So when you have a trial, everyone is supposed to try very hard to be neutral and objective and dispassionate and even-handed, and to look like they're being neutral, not just being neutral. And what's happening with the IPCC is we have all kinds of green activists who are being chosen to be lead authors and to lead chapters. They have an agenda, okay? A green organization raises money by scaring people. So anyone who has worked for 20 years for Greenpeace is not an objective scientist. They cannot be part of the jury that decides whether CO2 is guilty, because their organization has already made up its mind.
So you're saying that there are lead authors who have contributed to the what do you call them, the assessment reports?
Yes.
Who have been card-carrying members of
employees of green groups. So for example, Bill Hare is a very well-known Greenpeace activist. You can find remarks on Greenpeace websites that say he's a legend in the Greenpeace organization. Well, Bill Hare has been involved with the IPCC for a long time. And last time they put out their assessment report in 2007, he was one of only 40 people who was part of the core writing team for the summary of summaries. Okay, so it's not just out on the margins, you find a Greenpeace person here and there. This man is part of the core writing team. Okay, you look into the heart of the IPCC and you find a Greenpeace employee, a legend in Greenpeace. So there are a number of other Greenpeace people, affiliations that are a problem. One of the other people involved with the IPCC for a long time is Richard Moss. He's an American. Now, for a while he was working with the IPCC, he was also a vice president of the World Wildlife Fund. Now those are the people that bring us Earth Hour. You know, their main concern these days is climate change. So at the same time that he's supposed to be this neutral guy on the jury deciding whether CO2 is guilty or not, he's taking a paycheck from the World Wildlife Fund. Another person with the World Wildlife Fund with those kinds of connections is a woman named Jennifer Morgan. Now, she has spent her entire career working for activist organizations. I'm sure she's a very pleasant person, but she is by no stretch of the imagination one of the world's top scientists. In fact, one of her previous jobs was as the chief spokesperson on climate change for the World Wildlife Fund. And now she is helping prepare the report that is about to come out this September. So how could this be? How could this be? And in fact, when I started looking carefully at World Wildlife Fund links, around 2004, which was when the last report was just getting underway, the World Wildlife Fund did something very curious. They deliberately went out and recruited climate scientists. And then they bragged that they had recruited 130 scientists, mostly but not exclusively from the IPCC, to sit on a World Wildlife Fund panel. So at the very time when these scientists are supposed to be this dispassionate, neutral jury deciding some very important questions that the whole world is waiting for the answer, they're partying with the WWF. They're hanging out with the WWF. So when I started noticing that and looking at the names, my calculations by the end of it was that 2/3 of the chapters in the last IPCC report, out of 44 chapters, 2/3 of those chapters had at least one person and up to 8 people with links to the WWF.
Wow.
And 1/3 of the chapters was actually led by a person with WWF connections. Usually a chapter has 2 leaders, and so 1/3 of the chapters had at least one person, and in one case there were both of the leaders had WWF connections. So, you know, if you're conducting a trial, you have to look like you're neutral, and the IPCC is not a grown-up. It's not a professional organization. It's not playing, you know, at a world-class level. It's, you know, come on. You want me to take your opinion seriously, and you've got all of these people with these very strong activist connections? How can I trust your judgment? This is basic stuff.
Well, a lot of people would argue, though, that the science is settled, that it's not really a problem that there are activists within the IPCC, because they're activists agitating in favour of a question that's already been answered. If we already know that CO2 is the culprit, if the science really is settled, then surely we're going to have people who believe that CO2 is the culprit working for organisations, because that's settled.
Well, except you have to pay attention to the actual things that the IPCC says. So the IPCC wrote 4 major reports, and when the last one came out in 2007, what they said was that it is our opinion that there has been unequivocal warming over the last couple hundred years. Well, we all know that because 1850 was the end of the Little Ice Age. So big surprise, people, that it has been gradually warming since 1850. So the warming is unequivocal, and in our opinion, most of the warming in the last 50 years is very likely to have been caused by humans. Our opinion, most of the warming, they can't tell you how much, and then they can't tell you with certainty. They're just, our opinion is that it's very likely. That doesn't sound like settled science to me. That sounds like the experts are giving us their opinion. And experts have a long history of being wrong. So, you know, what the people who write the IPCC report are doing is exactly that. They are giving us their opinion of what the data tells us. And so it's very important that the people who are providing that opinion be neutral and look like they're neutral.
In order to keep and maintain public trust.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, okay, that's a lot on the authors and their credentials and so on and so forth. Your book ranges a lot more widely than that. So let's just dip into some of the other things that you've discovered along the way and some of the other topics that you cover. Take it away.
Well, one of the things is that the chairman of the IPCC has been going around the world for many years saying we rely solely on peer-reviewed literature, that everything we look at when we write our report has that stamp of peer-reviewed literature. It has gone through this process. It has been published in a reputable scientific journal, and if it's not been published, then we don't have anything to do with it. In fact, it belongs in the dustbin. Right. He's actually said things like that over and over and over again. Well, that turns out to be total nonsense. And you know, the first time I read this economist, Richard Tall, wrote a blog post. And he said, you know, I'm very annoyed because in this part of the IPCC report, they ignored the peer-reviewed literature and what those conclusions were, and they cited non-peer-reviewed literature, gray literature it's sometimes called, to make the opposite point. And I thought, wait a minute, it's all supposed to be peer-reviewed literature. How could that be? So for the very first time, I went and I looked at that particular chapter of the IPCC report. They're all online. It's very easy to do. Went to the end of it, and there are pages and pages of references that were cited within that chapter. And I started saying, okay, so is this a peer-reviewed piece of literature? Yes. Is that one? No. Is that one? No. And for the very first time, I did something. This report was 3 years old, and no one else, no other journalist had ever done this before, actually go and look at that list. And so what I found was that a startling number were not from the peer-reviewed literature. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, maybe it's just this chapter. So then I went and looked at another chapter, and that one was even worse. So in terms so I think, you know, one was 50% and one was 26% were peer-reviewed citations, but the rest of the sources in that list were not.
So a majority of the sources,
in some cases,
in some of the chapters that you looked at, and we're talking about the AR4 report, the 2007
That's right.
IPCC report, which is still online. Anyone could go and double check
That's right. Yes.
what you've looked at. A majority of the sources in some of the chapters were not peer-reviewed.
That's right. That's right.
That really jars me because I'm one of the people who's heard over and over again that it is all the settled science, it's all the peer-reviewed literature, it's all the best literature that's out there.
So yes, and that's what I heard and that's what I believed, and I read it again and again. So I said to myself, well, you know, we have to figure this out. There's 44 chapters, there's lots of references, I can't do this myself. So in 2010, I asked for volunteers to help me. I asked on my blog, and these amazing people from all over the world stepped forward and helped me examine all 44 chapters. It was something like 18,000 references altogether. I think 18,500, some of them were in there. And so what happened was 3 people working independently. They didn't know each other. They didn't know they had the same chapter. Went and did those calculations. What's peer-reviewed journal? What's not? And they sent in their results to me. When there was a small discrepancy, we took the one that was most favorable to the IPCC. We, you know, give them the benefit of the doubt. We're not going to be nitpicking here. And so at the end of the process, which was 5 weeks of very intense counting and lots of emails from all over the world and lots of time zones coming in and going out again, the conclusion was that a full 30% of the sources being cited by the IPCC in its 2007 report were not peer-reviewed literature. They hadn't come within a mile of being peer-reviewed literature. Some of them were press releases. Now anyone can say anything in a press release, as you very well know. Some of them were Greenpeace documents. Some of them were student theses. Other ones were working papers that had simply been, delivered at a conference, and there had been no checking of any sort had gone on. So 1/3 of all of the total references. And as you worked your way through the report, by the time you got to working group 3, there's working group 1, 2, and 3 in the IPCC report, often the vast majority of the references were not peer-reviewed literature. So what does this tell you about this organization? The chairman is going around repeatedly saying to everyone who will listen, including testifying before committees of politicians, we only look at peer-reviewed literature. Well, lots and lots of people knew that he was telling a fib. And no one pulled him aside and said, "Sir, we can't say that. That's not true."
Yeah.
And you've heard all about these letters, the open letters that all kinds of scientists get together and they write an open letter and say, "We have to do this something right now, or the world's going to end." All those open letters. Why didn't a bunch of people who were participants in the IPCC report get together and write an open letter to a newspaper or to an academic journal and say, "Hey, we support the IPCC, we think what it's doing is important, but the public is being misled." 1/3 of the references are not, or a large number of them, we're the only ones who,
actually did
the math. That's
and
right.
The one that brought it to your attention in the first place was a case where the person who actually brought it up was saying that the literature they chose, the non-peer-reviewed literature they chose, was saying the opposite.
That's right.
Of the peer-reviewed literature that they could have chosen.
And in my book, I discuss a number of situations like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it's accidental. It looks like people go in to the IPCC writing process with a narrative in mind, and they choose their literature that is going to support that narrative. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be surveying the literature in an honest way, in a dispassionate way, and writing in a report about what that literature says. But that's not what happens. So we have an IPCC that is very renowned and is very respected, and people say, "Oh, but look, there's all these procedures." Well, you can write down all the rules you want, but rules are no good if you're not enforcing them.
Yeah.
So you can have your speed limits, but unless there are some police giving people speeding tickets, people don't follow the speed limit, even though they know there are police around. Well, in my book, I say the IPCC is a bit like that. They put all these rules on paper. They sound very impressive, but there's no enforcement mechanism. There is no one in the IPCC structure who goes around and says, "You didn't follow that rule, and so you have to rewrite that." And what happened when the last report came out in 2007 is there were all kinds of problems. There were all kinds of rules that had been broken, and did anyone call them on it? Did the press say, "Yes, but you didn't follow that rule and you didn't follow that rule"? No, they got a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Shortly after the report came out in 2007, the IPCC shares the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore, and there could not be any better demonstration of how you can break all sorts of rules at the IPCC, and my book talks about many of them, and there are absolutely no consequences. In fact, you get a Nobel Prize out of it, right? So we have been told all of these things. There are rules. This is the literature we look at, and only this literature. This is the people who are writing those reports. It turns out none of it is actually. It really is a house of cards.
So, if we can't trust the IPCC, who can we trust? Is there a body out there that is actually doing genuinely transparent, peer-reviewed work on this issue that we could turn to as a replacement, I guess, for the IPCC?
Not that I'm aware of. I think, what I say at the end of my book is, when you have a murder case and you find out that someone on the jury actually had an interest or a conflict, then you have to say, we throw out the conviction. We have to start at the beginning again. We have to do the trial over again, and we have to get people, we have to select our people more carefully this time so that they don't come with any preconceived notions. We need a new trial. We need an organization, presumably, that has conflict of interest rules that are followed, that is going to follow its procedures, is going to have enforcement mechanisms in place. I don't know where we get that organization. And frankly, this is a UN body. It was established by, the UN is a political body. They set up the IPCC. And it's not science academies who sit around and say, who are the best people in this field? Let's get them to write the report. No, it's governments. And so governments change. When Bill Clinton and Al Gore were running the US, the scientists who got nominated to work on the IPCC were probably different than when George Bush was running the US, right? So when governments are choosing scientists, there is room for political
influence.
That's right. So I don't think that that politics and science mix very well. And we're told that the IPCC is out there to tell us what's going on with climate change, but in fact, there's actually another reason, the real reason the IPCC exists, and that is because the UN decided back in 1992. Now, 1992, the IPCC had been around for a mere 4 years, okay? Climate science was a very immature science in 1992, but the UN had already decided that human-generated CO2 was a problem. And at the Earth Summit in 1992, 60 countries signed on to a treaty that says we have to control CO2 emissions. The politics came before the science. And so the purpose of the IPCC is to write a document that says where the science is. So when the countries are negotiating to advance the aims of that treaty, they're all on the same page. Right? That's really what the IPCC report is for. It is a basis for politicians to negotiate a political treaty. It's not about science. And the scientists are not in charge. And we're going to see that in a few months because the science section, Working Group 1, is going to finish their report, and the scientists are going to write a summary. The report is probably going to be about 1,000 pages, and the summary, for policymakers, they call it, is going to be a couple dozen pages. And that's a very difficult thing, taking 14 chapters and boiling them down to a few dozen pages. Well, if this was a science body, that's where it would stop. The scientists would write the summary and they would give it to the head of the IPCC, and that would be the end of the matter. But that's not what's going to happen. The IPCC in late September is going to have a 4-day meeting in which this document, this summary, which was written by scientists, is going to have every single sentence argued over by diplomats and politicians and bureaucrats. The summary of what the science says is going to get rewritten in a political negotiating session that's going to last 4 days.
That's just bizarre.
So the scientists don't have the last word on what their report says. The politicians will decide by horse trading. And some of these meetings in the past have gone 24/7 in the last few days because they have to rush to finish it all. So politicians are going to decide what the science report says.
So let's see if I can try and put the pieces together here and summarize. We have a body that is perceived to be the peak scientific body, using non-peer-reviewed literature, written in some cases by undergraduates and people who do not yet have the kinds of credentials that the IPCC would have us believe. Some of whom have vested interests and preconceived notions about what should or shouldn't be said or what their opinion should or shouldn't be, which is then second-guessed by policymakers, politicians and bureaucrats who have probably not much of a better understanding of the science than you and I. And that then becomes the most authoritative document, the Bible, if you will.
That summary is going to be what the world's politicians and the world's journalists read.
That's
Right.
incredible.
That's right.
So Donna, if we can't rely on the IPCC to have provided us with just absolute bulletproof, reliable information, and what you're telling me is that the information does not live up to the standards that the IPCC itself sets for itself. What does that say of policy responses, carbon taxes, trading schemes, the kinds of things that we've seen introduced in Australia and in Europe, the kinds of things that Barack Obama has just recently in a speech put climate change back on the agenda for the US? What are we doing introducing policies to fight climate change if the IPCC's data is not necessarily reliable to begin with? How do we manage this side of the issue?
Well, and that is the issue. You know, there are lots of taxes, there are lots of regulations being put in place to deal with a problem that, frankly, we don't know if it's really a problem or not, because the organizations that are telling us that it is, they're not reliable, they're not trustworthy, they have not been behaving in a trustworthy manner. So yes, we have a problem now, and it is, in my view, insane to spend lots of time and money putting policies in place to respond to a problem that we're not even sure exists, and we're not even sure is a serious problem. So, you know, as a journalist, when I look at climate policy, I find an astonishing absence of rigor. What I find is expensive decisions and important decisions being made, and no one has done the math. It's crazy. But that's climate policy at the moment.
That is incredible. And so to get from where we are now to a situation where we can actually bring some sense into the debate, obviously we talked a moment ago about the need to almost start again, retrial, you know, throw out the old jury and have a retrial. In the mind of the public, what could someone who's watching this do to help prepare and educate themselves? If they were willing to be that neutral observer, how would they begin to find, I mean, you were saying you managed to find people who had a different point of view, and that's how you started. You simply wanted that alternative point of view to be heard and to be seen. Where can people go to hear these voices?
Well, I think, you know, just healthy skepticism is a good place to start. And, you know, there is actually now a very vibrant discussion happening online. You know, whether you want to access it by Twitter or Facebook or the blogosphere, there are actually some you know, you just you know, Google climate change and the climate debate, and there are different voices out there. And I think it's very important that people actually expose themselves to a variety of opinions. And, you know, I don't know who's right. I started out just saying the public has a right to know that there is a debate going on. And I now call myself a climate skeptic because after nearly 4 years of research, I have not seen anything that convinces me that there is a catastrophe in the making. What I've seen is a lot of assumptions piled on assumptions, piled on assumptions, and at each level there are serious reasons to question whether that assumption is valid or not. So you know, I think we need more discussion, we need more debate, and I am very cross whenever I hear politicians like Ed Davey, who's the energy minister in the UK this week, say, you know, there shouldn't be a debate, the debate is over, anyone who's a skeptic is a crackpot. Pardon me, when did it become the job of an elected official to insult the viewpoint of large numbers of the public? You know, that is just not appropriate behavior.
Donna, I want to go right back to a comment you made a while ago about experts and how often they've been wrong. I want to pick that up because that I think is quite an astonishing thing in a post-Enlightenment era where science is so respected and scientists are supposed to be so reliable and applying a scientific method that keeps them honest removes their own biases and makes sure that what they're telling us really is the best of our knowledge at this point in time. We can all allow for knowledge to improve and knowledge to change, but at any given point in time, the experts are supposed to be telling us the best that we know. Yet that seems to not be the case here with the IPCC. Is this an unprecedented problem? Are we facing a downfall of science in a sense?
I think certainly science's reputation is suffering. I used to have great respect for science and scientists until I started doing this research. My opinion of scientists and scientific bodies has plummeted as a result. And that's a sad thing. That is a sad thing. I think we need to remember that the experts are usually wrong. Historically, the experts have been wrong about all sorts of things. And, just in one person's lifetime, when I was a child, the big scare when I was in primary school was acid rain. And we got sat down and shown these scary films about how by the time we were grown up, there were going to be no forests left because they were going to be wiped out by, all these terrible chemicals that industry was putting into the atmosphere. Well, there was a bit of concern, there was a bit of a kernel of truth to that, but the big scare was way overblown and was exaggerated. But that was the experts of the day telling us. And then there was the ozone layer, right? And then there was, prior to that, there was global cooling. And prior to that, there was the population bomb. Millions of people were going to starve to death because we couldn't possibly feed this many humans. There's always something. And that is interesting. We should know our history, and we should also understand that psychologically there's obviously something in us as human beings where we have been primed by evolution to always be worried about our survival and our existence. So we are very predisposed to a narrative that says, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. And we're also predisposed to a narrative that says, the Eden myth, that we have sinned and now we have to, we're going to be punished, right? So it's not God punishing us, it's Mother Nature punishing us. Those ideas are very powerful in our psyche. And the other thing is that there are all kinds of temperaments, there are all kinds of personalities out there. I think of myself as a calm, cool, and collected person, personality type. But there are also drama queens, right? And everything is always a crisis. It's not a problem. The world's going to end, right? This is the drama queens deserve a voice, but we should not be letting our public policy be dominated by that voice. They should be part of the debate, but not, leading us. And I think that person is a drama queen. That doesn't mean they're bad. It just means the way their personality makeup, they're going to take every small issue and think it's the end of the world. Rather than my personal approach is, we're smart, we're ingenious, we are creative, and we will solve the problems that come our way, and so will our children and grandchildren.
Well, Donna, it's been an absolute pleasure, and just before we finish, I just want to throw it open to you, and if there's anything else that we haven't covered yet or that you really think people ought to know about, now's the time. Just think for yourself and, trust yourself. And there are lots of experts. As a journalist, I can tell you that I can find an expert who will say anything if I call enough people and do enough research. So really, the experts often don't know any more than you and I about what's going to happen in the future. And there has been no case that I'm aware of where anyone has ever been successful at predicting the future. So the idea that climate scientists have this crystal ball and they know what's coming, I find that very hard to believe, and I would hope that the average person, who's very sensible and who's dealing with real problems in the real world, would think about that. Skepticism. Exactly. A healthy dose of skepticism. Absolutely. Well, Donna, thank you very much for your time. My pleasure. Thank you.